Hey everyone, I hope you're having a good week. We have the outline due this weekend, so I just wanted to make this video to help guide you all in developing your thesis statements and getting your outline created, which will be the pre-writing activity for then the draft that's going to happen next week. So you already found secondary sources through the library databases, and you completed annotated bibliographies this past weekend. Um, the next step is to start developing your thesis, and you will need to do that by rereading the sources, particularly the primary source or sources that you're using by the author that you chose. So primary sources are the pieces of poetry or the short fiction from our textbook. And secondary sources are considered pieces of research like interviews with the author, documentary, literary criticism, things like that. So when you go to write your outline, you'll need to reference both the primary source or sources that you plan to use in the essay and a minimum of 3 secondary sources, so the ones that you presented in the annotated bib. I'll start with thesis development because I think that will help you then create your outline if you first think about, well, what is it that I'm going to focus on now that you've read text by the author and you've read what others have to say about the author. You may have noticed certain literary elements being discussed more than others. So symbolism, right? Symbolism, theme, tone, figurative language, characterization. There's a ton of different literary elements that you have to choose from. Here's an example of Nathaniel Hawthorne and his text, Young Goodman Brown. So that author, he uses symbolism to describe the character Faith. And so even though this is a female character in the story, there's a bigger meaning, and there's the theme of how does one hold on to one's faith during challenging times. So there's like 2 stories, right? There's the literal read. The literal read is that there's a woman and she's going to this devil's gathering in the woods, and she's lost her pink ribbon from her hair. But the symbolism to that is that it's someone who's lost their faith, and the pink is supposed to be purity, so it's like the loss of purity. So if you have chosen a text or 2 where you see a common literary element, then that might be what you want to focus on. And then even though I'm choosing to focus on symbolism in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, I can use a lot of information about the author's background, his family's participation. He had uncles that were judges in the Salem witch trials. And, how does his biographical information give me more knowledge when analyzing his text and his use of symbolism? So just because I'm asking you all to form a thesis that is specific to some kind of literary element that the author is using, it does not mean that you cannot then use your body paragraphs to discuss the author's background, their childhood, if they had loved ones who died and that made them depressed, and that's why they talk about certain themes. All of that can still be discussed, but the thesis should talk about some kind of literary element having the influence over, having a guiding force over that text. If you're using more than one primary source, then you can compare text and you can recognize and discuss the author's use of elements over different texts. But if you're only using one, then you want to recognize how that literary element functions in that one work. So how does the symbolism help the author direct focus to a theme, or is it assisting in character development? If you have an idea for a thesis and it does not include identifying a literary element, you can still submit that on your outline. The outline is a preliminary writing assignment, so you do not have to have your thesis perfectly stated at this point. It's a working thesis. Then you'll have the rough draft, so you'll have another chance to revise. But this outline, I really want to give some feedback on the thesis statements because it is kind of like the glue that's holding the paper together. And you'll see when I show you the template that if you choose a thesis that then discusses, a few literary elements or talks about a couple literary elements across 2 or 3 texts by the author, then you'll be able to then break down those sub concepts when you go to write the body paragraphs of your essay, and you'll have a better organization. You'll find that you have more to write about versus if you just read these biographical sources on the authors and then you try to summarize and just inform your readers about what you read, then there's no analysis, right? So we still want to make sure that it's a literary analysis essay. So there needs to be some sort of analytical point of view that looks at how the author writes and the influences on the writing. Since the outline is really just an early step right after you did your initial research, then you will definitely have a working thesis. It may change, and that's fine. That actually does show growth, and sometimes we go back and we reread things and we see we have different interpretations. So, as you go back and read your primary sources again, you may see literary elements that you didn't notice at first, so your thesis statement may change. The thesis statement should, though, take a basic format that names the author and the literary works and makes an opinion statement. So, in Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, the author uses the character Faith to symbolize Goodman Brown's religious faith in order to suggest a theme that loss of one's religious faith will cause one to question other beliefs as well. So that's one example. Even though it's a statement of opinion, you'll see there's no first person point of view. So that's where sometimes I see students struggle with feeling like, well, if I don't write in first person, like I believe or I think, then I'm losing, my opinion about the text. But in fact, if you write in first person, then you're almost isolating it as, oh, this is my opinion and no one else shares it. And since these texts are read by, hundreds of thousands of people, you're likely not the only person to interpret the text the way you are. So it's almost incorrect to say like, oh, I think this, because you're not the only person that thinks that. So it's better to remain objective and focus on the text and the author and the literary elements and remove first person from any type of academic research paper. The second example is just kind of a different take. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown is a piece of short fiction that challenged the ideals of Christianity and the concept of faith. So later on, I would discuss those challenges. Maybe, I could always have 2 sentences for a working thesis statement. 1 to 2 is fine for a thesis. And here, maybe I can say something like Hawthorne's use of tone, word choice, and symbolism, blah, blah, blah. And now that gives me 3 different literary elements to discuss in my body paragraphs. All right, so that's always a good technique to use, is try to set up a thesis statement with like 3 key points. So tips on developing a thesis statement. One way to help you figure out what a thesis is to start with a research question. And then the answer to your research question is your thesis statement. So a thesis is never a question. But if you attempt to answer that question, then that's what forms a thesis. So a question could be like, how did Hawthorne's family background influence how and what he wrote? All right, so then I answer that by saying Hawthorne's family background influenced the way he wrote and blah, blah, blah. So that's the first step. It can be very helpful just to create a research question for you to then attempt to answer. You want to consider the critical approach that you're using. So some of those can overlap, historical approach or a gender approach or biographical approach. You may use some of those details no matter what, because that provides context, but you do want to consider, okay, well, what is my main objective? Am I just trying to focus on how this author's life experiences impacted how and what they wrote? Then you're going for a biographical approach. And then, of course, when you're writing your thesis statement, you want to be specific. You don't want to have, cliche words like, oh, the author is has a good way of describing, characters or something like good doesn't give us enough details. So that can be revised as we look at your outlines and your drafts, but just something to think about. And then also there's this so what test. So have someone else read your thesis statement and see if that gets them interested, or what else can you add to it that would be providing more details that they are able to predict what the rest of the essay is going to be about. All right, and now that you have your thesis statement begun, you will start to outline, and there is a template in Module 6. You can choose either full sentences or phrases. Full sentences are easier to transition into a draft, but you can use phrases and incomplete sentences, and that's fine. You want to be specific when possible. So instead of saying something vague like, I'm going to use a quote, in the introduction, you want to actually insert and cite the quote you want to use. So then that way, when you go to draft, you've already typed and cited the quote, and you can just copy and paste that into your draft. When you are outlining, you want to make sure that you reference all the required sources. So the draft requires you to have at least 3 secondary sources from the library, in addition to 1 to 3 primary texts by the author that you are researching. All right, so here is the outline template. It's in the Dropbox. Here I have a lot of details that helps you understand what is it that I mean, like historical context. It doesn't need to provide an entire history of the author, but it does give us some kind of context to make the reader aware of when it was that this text was written. So what kind of maybe influential events were taking place when the text was published. When we get down to the Roman numeral 3, these are the main body paragraphs that introduce your primary and secondary sources. So I have completed, when you open the template, this Word doc that I have at the top, you'll see blank details here. So you'll see like hook, and then you need to fill this in. So this is an example of how to complete the outline. You'll open it up, you'll put in your information, you'll change the outline title to something that reflects, your upcoming research paper. And then beside hook, you can give me specific details, or you can at least just give me a general idea. So here I put shocking biographical fact. So then that way I know, all right, you're going to lead off with some kind of shocking fact about the author that you're researching. When it comes to historical context, this is where you don't have to give a full background about the author, but you can at least say, okay, I'm going to put author's family background here, and then maybe something was going on during the time of event. Like civil rights, right? Maybe that was happening when your author was writing. So fill this out and let me know if you have any